Well, good afternoon, friends, and welcome to our next installment of Face to Face with Racism. This week we're discussing It's Just a Joke and Other Microaggressions and how those constitute covert forms of white supremacy and racism. I'm Reverend Jeffrey Moore. This is Reverend Heather Goddess Moore. We're pastors at St. Stephen United Methodist Church, and we're glad that you've joined us. Our guests this afternoon, our panelists, I should say, are Jackie Orr. Jackie grew up at St. Stephen United Methodist. She is a biracial elementary school counselor in MISD. And Blake Fullenwider, also another lifelong St. Stephenite. He's white and works for Benson Engineering. Jeff Casper is a good friend of St. Stephen, an active citizen in Mesquite, teaches civics and human geography. Is that human? Yeah.
I'm so intrigued by this.
Human geography at West Mesquite High School. Recently finished a term on the Mesquite City Council, also Caucasian. And we hope to be joined shortly by Minh Nguyen, also a friend and fellow activist here in Mesquite. He is Vietnamese, a first-generation immigrant. His family fled Saigon shortly before the fall of Saigon. He went to Poteet High School. He was the only Vietnamese member of his class until his senior year. So we hope he'll be able to sign in here in just a minute. But time is short, so we'll start with Jackie and any opening thoughts you might have about It's Just a Joke and Other Microaggressions.
Okay. Well, I do have some personal experiences with them. Growing up in the there were a few people who looked like me, but not too many. Definitely not a lot of students who were biracial. So I did get many questions that I think people didn't realize were hurtful. So questions about my hair, asking maybe if they could touch my hair. Is that my real hair, or is it a weave? I must be mixed with something to have good hair like this, instead of to be fully black and have this type of hair. A lot of it is on physical aspects, I think, and it just because of being a girl rather than a boy. A lot of people get noticed. I also would have some microaggressions to me about music. Saying that I speak well, I don't sound like a white person. That would even come from close friends who maybe black as well, and then I'd have to sit and think, was there something wrong with the way that I talk? I just always left it up to that my mom was a teacher, and so that's why I talk like that. But I would have to think, should I be speaking some other way? Should I be looking some other way? Asking about my hair. I also go to sports, and so there's a little microaggressions about, well, she's black, she's really fast, she can jump really fast, or I want to go to my team. Which at the time, I think, oh yeah, they picked great. But then as we got older, you think about things, it really was like a great comment, maybe. It was supposed to be a compliment, but like, why were you reading anything? So those are just a couple things that as I've grown up and looked over, I was just kind of like, okay, I did do a lot of this, but just being younger and growing into it was hard to put and really actually know what it was.
I think that's, thank you for that very clear and vulnerable picture. I think it's hard for people to understand sometimes the concept of microaggression because what they say, right, is, well, I meant it as a compliment.
Mhm.
I was complimenting how well you speak, right?
Mhm.
But that is premised on two things. One, that the way you're speaking is normative. That's one. That's the supremacy part,
Mhm.
or half of it, I guess. And the other is that Black people don't speak that way. The only reason your speech is remarkable, for example, is because other Black people don't speak that well. And so that's the aggression part. And the micro part is I package it with a bow
Make it sound like a compliment.
and make it sound like a compliment.
Right.
I'm going to drop Min in. Welcome, Min.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Sorry about that.
No, you are perfectly on time. It's I've already introduced you. So any opening thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Forrest. And this is such an important issue, especially recently. Just recently, I was with a group of friends who I used to work with in politics, and it was just when coronavirus started coming up. And one of them turned to me and goes, "This started with somebody eating bats. You eat kind of funny stuff, don't you?" And I was like, "I mean Chipotle, dude. I mean, we're all eating Chipotle." And I'm kind of looking at him, I was like, what do you mean by that? First of all, you told me you ate stuff that was kind of funny, kind of like, have you ever eaten bats? I go, we use different seasoning. Yeah. You know, we use some fish sauce. I mean, it's not, I'm capturing bats. So it was really insulting. And also the idea that my culture brought this on. And I'm Vietnamese, not Chinese. And so we had a interesting discussion. So I thought that was a good example of what a microaggression would be. They just assume, my culture is funny, the way we eat, and that we can spread a virus because we eat weird things. And they assumed that was Chinese, which is even no. And so I really want to think of this discussion, and then every once in a while I find myself saying something, and sometimes it's even within my own race where it's kind of like, get along to go along, like when we watch 16 Candles and that crazy Oriental music comes on when Long Duck Dong comes on, right? And that's kind of, we laugh at it, we make a joke at it. Really, that's terrible, right? And so people talk about political correctness culture. I think it's good. It's just showing respect to different cultures. And that's kind of my idea of microaggressions, because I'm so tired of people hearing, man, people are offended by everything. It's like, no, we've always been offended. I mean, there's people are offended by everything now, because I think we've always been offended. We just don't want to call you on your crap. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thanks. Blake.
Yeah, so first off, I have a few things. I grew up with Jackie, so I guarantee you I, along the way, said things that fall into this category. So first off, I apologize to you, Jackie, if that ever came out. You do start to look back and realize when you grow up some of the stupid things you said or did. And we had a lot of time together, so I'm sure there's plenty along the way. And I did always want you on my team. So I was trying to think of an example of when, I unintentionally, because that, to me, that's what it is. It's like you're unintentionally being racist, right? And my biggest example that I know I'm guilty of is when I explain to people where I live now. And it's, right at Buckner and 30. And I always say, for whatever reason, oh, well, we're right in between the $1 million Forest Hills houses and then the hood of Buckner and 30. And I never had intentions of it meaning what exactly it means. But there's no other way around it. I don't know. That's something that I just kind of pointed that out to me. And it is, I'm guilty of that and need to figure out a better way to explain where I live. But then another thing I was thinking about that came up, and this happened to me last week at Subway, is when people see that I'm white and just assume that it's okay to say these types of things to me. So the Subway right here by my house, actually, on Buckner, they just got a new card reader. And so I went up and I noticed it was new. And it started doing my favorite thing now. Anywhere you use a card that it wanted a tip. And I was just like, no, not here. You did this, I'm paying for it, and I'm going to get out now. So I pushed no tip. There was a very clear option. And no harm, no foul. Got my receipt. I'm getting my drink. And the guy, the shop owner or whoever, he says, hey, did you like the new card reader? And I said, yeah, it's fine. I wanted to say I was annoyed that it asked me for a tip, but no big deal. And he said, well, you know, we had a huge issue yesterday because, you know, all the black people are pissed off that it's asking for a tip. And I was like, oh, okay. And he was like, I mean, it's really easy, isn't it? You didn't have any problems with it. And I was like, no, I mean, it's clear. And he was like, well, I called the owner and I told him that we can't have this kind of card reader in this part of town. And I was like, you just probably tell them that there's a no tip option right there is also an option, and not assume things. But I don't know. I didn't know how to handle it, and I wasn't as bothered by it until I got in my car and was thinking about like why we even had that conversation right then. So I don't know. That was something I wanted to point out.
Thanks. That's yeah, I think we find ourselves more and more in those kind of uncomfortable situations. And you want to say, well, gosh, I'm white and I had a problem with it asking me if I wanted to tip.
Yeah, I mean, it was really bizarre, and he's not white, so it's just kind of a weird situation.
Jeff, what about your experience with microaggressions?
Well, very similar to Blake. I grew up obviously in tremendous privilege as a white male in a suburban community. And when I attended Horn High School and graduated in 2005, it was predominantly Caucasian, 80% plus, right? And our friends were inclusive, and I'd like to think we were accepting, but I would be just horrified to have flashbacks of things that we said to our friends of color. You know, hey, you talk white, or hey, I'm interested that you listen to Blink 182, or, you know, that's not normal, and all these kind of microaggressions that I'm sure we were exploring each other's family and background and interests, but it was definitely aggressive, right? These microaggressions that we're talking about. And so, you know, I would just be horrified to look back on the youth and the things that I did there. Now, I'd like to think, obviously, I've grown, but I'm still very much convicted in a lot of my modern experiences, having served on the city council, and the code switching that I did, that I am guilty of, for operating in that theater of municipal politics, which is older and whiter and more conservative, and the things that I would allow to be said in a meeting, or the things that I would just kind of nod my head at when I knocked a door of an older, whiter voter who was disturbed by Mesquite's demographic changes, and fearful of those changes. And just what I tolerated, like Blake said, as a white male, folks think you're in the club, and they will open up and say things to you. And they think, you know, this is just insider, you know, locker room talk or whatever. And of course, not everyone tweets white power, but there are folks that say things on a door or in a meeting that are coded, right? And we could talk about the use of law and order in our politics, that phrase, or the phrase thug, the phrase of multi-family apartments, and all of this coded language that I know when it hit my ear, I know what it meant, but I didn't stop the meeting and call it out, right? And so those are things that I'm going to have to, you know, think about when I try to go sleep at night. So those are things that I wish I could have do-overs on. I still know that I am working on my comfortability level and my understanding of my trans friends. I have friends who have transitioned, and I grew up with them. And for me, a lot of my memory of our friendship and our experiences was their birth gender and not their actual gender, right? And so as I'm using pronouns and as I'm saying generic pronouns, like the Texan in me should just say y'all all the time, right? But oftentimes I say, hey, you guys. And for someone that is transitioned, that's they've put in a lot of sacrifice and a lot of work to be the gender that they are. And for me to use that kind of language can be triggering oftentimes. So those are some of the things I think about in my personal life. Now, as an educator, I really try to hone in and pay attention because we're talking about microaggressions, and a lot of our conversation so far has been verbal, right? But there's often nonverbal microaggressions as well. Who do I call on? Who do I see as the expert in the classroom? When I need that right answer and our lecture is really struggling, what student do I say, hey, help us out, right? Which ones do I lift up? When we do group work, which ones do I see in a leadership role? All of these things I think are personal and nonverbal microaggressions that I really need to analyze. And then as a member of an institution, one that is, I would hope, but we got fellow educators on the panel, one that is predominantly centered in the value of growing human beings, right, and making them better over time. Am I calling out that institution when it's failing to live up to that mindset as well, right? And so just some nonverbal institutional microaggressions that I think about are, who do we promote? Who do we see as institutional leaders? What does our school board look like? For many of my students, they see teachers as wealthy, right? They think my salary is oftentimes equivalent to their household income, right? And so all of these kind of things, if we hire predominantly white teachers over a student body that is predominantly students of color, who do they see as professional and capable and in leadership roles, right? So these are all things that I'm chewing on and struggling with and hoping to kind of advance the football on.
Thank you. You point to an important aspect of the conversation, and that is that that the reference to locker room talk. So I don't think that I mean, a microaggression, it doesn't have to be spoken to someone of another ethnicity to be a microaggression, right? We have microaggressions that we trade within whiteness that serve to bolster up and build up that underlying principle of white supremacy and white normalcy. And those are microaggressions, even if no one of a particular ethnicity is there to hear them. Freddie Orr made a helpful comment. He says, I guess this would apply. A white older woman instant message me on Facebook instead of, Freddie, if more of them were like you, we would not be having this problem. Right? So there are several things going on there, all couched in what I'm sure she intends to be a compliment to Freddie. But if we go back to the comment about the hair or the speech, you know, there's a contrasting going on, which is valuing one thing and denigrating something else. Questions that this might have raised for Min or Jackie? Yeah.
Jeffrey, that's a good point when you talk about microaggressions within the same community. It's Vietnamese Americans, especially recently, we've been having a lot of discussions, and it's intergenerational. I think it is because it's happening the same thing in greater America. Our older generation being just casually racist, maybe macroaggressions, not just microaggressions, right? And having that conversation within your own race or your own family or your community coming up, they're painful. They're painful conversations because you're calling people out that you love. It's not enough to call out Donald Trump. That's easy, right? But when it's your mom or your aunt or your uncle, your dad or your brother, it's a little bit harder. And that's something. That's why these conversations are hard, because it's exhausting. I mean, because it's constant. It's like every conversation. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. But I have a question for Jackie too, and I guess everybody is there? Do you have a certain point where you're just like, man, I can't be the teacher today. You know, I just can't. I can correct every microaggression because it's everywhere and it's so much, and sometimes you have to just let things go just for a little piece, and then maybe pick a bigger fight. I just wonder if everybody has that issue, especially when it comes to something as nuanced as microaggression.
I would say yes. There's times and days where I would have those where it's just like I'm just gonna let it go. Like, it's not worth the aggravation or the heatedness that could happen. Like, I'm just gonna move on and go about my day. But there are other times where I have addressed it and we had a conversation, but it does get to be a lot. Earlier when you're talking about how things that you eat, and people would say stuff like, oh, you eat weird things or whatever, it made me think about movies that I watched when I was growing up, and there's always the token black friend. And when I was younger, I didn't really think much about it. I thought of myself as the token black friend because I grew up around like St. Stephen, predominantly a white church when I was growing up, and so that was me. And I didn't realize that I kind of was giving myself a microaggression in saying that, and not saying like that's not okay. But as you grow up, you realize some things, and so you say things, especially with stuff like that, when your friends might just be joking about movies and situations like that happen. So those would be cases where sometimes I let it go and just be like, oh yeah, that's great, and just laugh and keep moving. And then other times, I have to speak up and we'd have to have a conversation.
I think that Min and Jackie both, I think that points to, again, back to what Blake was saying earlier, sort of pointing to, that we have to take up a responsibility within the white community, obviously, for policing ourselves and policing each other. If we're not calling out each other, then we're basically saying black people, or whoever the object of the microaggression is, racism is your problem to fix. I've fixed myself, so I'm done.
Well, and if you're not calling out every single one of them, it's basically telling them that well, it's better than it was, but it still exists. But you need to be happy with the 20% that you're getting now, as opposed to the 100%. And so that's the struggle I have, is making sure that I stay on top of it every time I run into it. I didn't say anything at Subway, and I should have. So that's the struggle on my end, and it's far less than the struggle that those receiving it every day face. So that's what I try to tell myself, to stay on top of it, I guess.
And Blake, can I add? Min, when I think of kind of that question and how exhausting it must be to live under systemic racism, as a white ally, it's convicting for me if I have friends of color who are so exhausted because of that fight that they don't want to correct me, right? And that they don't want to call me out. And so for me, is it because I've not built up enough goodwill with that friend that they understand that I want to be corrected, and that we have that comfort and that trust. And so, I think for white allies, the onus is not on them, but do people of color in your network, do they feel like they can correct you? Or do they feel like that relationship is so shallow and so fragile right? That correction could be the end of it, right? And so that's something that I'm kind of struggling with and thinking through.
You know, Jeff, you just made me think about a post that you and I both commented on today in one of our groups, and how microaggressions, they are intersectional, for lack of a better term. And we will say things, you know, the title of this particular conversation is "It's Just a Joke and Other Microaggressions." And we'll make a joke that we think is funny and maybe other people think is funny, but actually does the work of further othering someone else. And this particular joke had to do with ableism and able-bodied persons and disabled persons. And so I think that one of the things that's really hard for us is, and I know Jeffrey and I do it sometimes, is we'll make jokes in the house and then kind of go, yeah, that wasn't really an appropriate joke to, you know, because it was a microaggression. And what that does is that internalizes it for us and makes it something that is okay to say outside of the house. And as parents, we know that there is no actual filter between when you walk out the door of the house that keeps all that stuff inside. So it's stuff that we constantly have to work on.
Well, and I would add to that, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about jokes as forms of microaggression, but I don't know, I wasn't raised this way, but somehow in my sort of development as a person, I learned to develop a very strong sense of sarcasm as a form of humor. And sarcasm, by its very nature, is a form of microaggression. And so I've had to rethink that whole thing every time I want to open my mouth and say something sarcastic and say, whoa, wait a minute. Men,
Getting too close to home, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
It's hard. Sarcasm is my second language.
Right.
It might even be my first.
Might be my spiritual language. Men, you look like you wanted to say something. No, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
I've been raising my hand because of the two teachers. So if you see my hand raised, I'm just trying to be good to Mr. Casper and Miss Jackie there. But Jeff saying, as your friend, Jeff, it's like sometimes you have certainly in our relationship built up the goodwill where something happens. Sometimes I don't want to say about it right away because there's no time for a real conversation, right? We're in the middle of something with group and I don't want to sidetrack a group. But it's something we can talk about afterwards. And that's one of the nuances. One of the things I've learned is that to have some of these tougher conversations after the fact or away. And it's some of the conversations I've had when I've been microaggressive about something that I don't know anything a lot about. Like during the Mesquite Pride thing, there's a lot of things I was so cautious and careful that I would text somebody and say, hey, let me run this through you. But sometimes I don't get a chance and I just do it. And I was like, oh man. So yeah, I think the goodwill, it's also situational, right? You can't always call everybody out right in the middle of a meeting of something. You want to maybe write it down and say later, hey dude, hey, about that comment, you know, it kind of rubbed me wrong. We can talk about it later over a beer or something. So I mean, don't sweat it too much because there's just time and place. And like I said, it's not just exhausting. It's hard to have these conversations because they're nuanced and they're long. Like, you know, we have 30 minutes to solve microaggressions and time's almost up. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, you're right, Min. Our time is almost up. And so we're going to wrap up this part of the conversation. And like we've ended the last couple, this one, I think, while it's maybe not as deep of a discussion or introspection to be doing, it might actually be very frustrating work for us as we're learning. And oh, okay. Well, let me close with this first. Well, because Freddie just made a comment, and I think is important to bring up. So, Freddie says, as I said in my sermon about 3 weeks ago, whites have seen and know right from wrong and have turned their head or a deaf ear to those wrongs. So when as a black person, when Freddie as a black person tries to point out or tries to correct those thoughts, then he's seen as going off or aggressive. Yeah. It has to come from the white community, so it does not always look like, oh, here we go again by someone who is black. Yeah. It's important work for us to do.
Yeah, and
that's the problem, right? The microaggressions have become so normalized that him responding is the outlier.
Right. So that's what, I mean, we hope these conversations contribute a little bit to foregrounding these issues, putting them out on the table, starting to unpack them, so that we can say, hey, remember that conversation we had about, let's move that forward a little bit. We can't do it all in half an hour.
No, we can't. So as you start paying attention to your words and your actions and how you go through your day, possibly participating in or allowing microaggressions, be kind to yourself and talk through it with people who you trust and care about, and give yourself grace and give grace to others, because the only way we can learn is if we keep doing the work and keep having the conversations. And if you shut down, it's not going to work out. It's frustrating because there will be a time where you'll be like, this is the 5th time today. How am I just can't keep it together? Just take a breath. It's okay. We're working through it together, and I'm grateful for all of you who come and watch these, and I hope that you are sharing them with people that you love and care about, even your family members who might not be as receptive, but this is what we do, and we look forward to doing it again next week. I don't remember what the topic is.
It starts with white. I remember that part.
It might be white savior complex.
It is white savior
complex.
Yeah.
Super exciting.
So show up next week and learn about white savior complex.
All right. Y'all take care. Thank you.